Um, you can't see that the chat, can you? In the screen there. Can you see the chat?
No.
No, that's good. Okay.
Oh, okay.
What?
Okay, welcome to another Coach's Corner, and we're joined by Marianne Davies. Thanks, Marianne, for joining us and coming on to talk about equestrianism and constraints and all things coaching. It's great to have you on. Just a brief intro before we get in. You know, Marianne is a senior coach developer with UK Coaching and has done the rounds really with a number of NGBs, and also worked professionally and academically in coaching. So it's really great to have you on and to have you share your experiences with us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marianne. Thanks for coming on. It's a far cry from a breakfast bar on Gloucester Road in Bristol, which is the last time we met, or the first time we met, actually, wasn't it? So nice to have you on. Thanks for coming on. I'm sure this is going to be fun. All right, so I'll just to get us going, just a little bit about you, Marianne. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself? What is your current role or roles, and how did you get there to start with, please?
Okay, gosh, there was a lot of off-pisting, I think, is probably the I think, like many people, I've definitely been wayfinding my way here. So yeah. Currently I am working for UK Coaching as a senior coach developer. So I'm sort of looking at how we sort of develop and deliver support for people who coaching coaches. And I'm also doing a PhD through Sheffield Hallam with an external supervisor from Hartpury University, looking at skill acquisition in equestrian sports. So looking at how we can apply the sort of ecological, dynamics, perspective and theoretical underpinnings to coaching practice in a sport that has a non-human in it as well. So, but my journey here, do you know, I always think actually it probably started just with some influences as a child. So my father was in the RAF, and then he was a civil engineer. So, but he didn't like moving into the sort of like the, wherever the accommodation was or the communities for the RAF. So we didn't follow the RAF, and we didn't follow, and live on the sites of
the barracks.
Construction sites, yes. Yeah, so no barracks, no construction sites. So we always moved into sort of more into the village and into those communities. But this meant that at a very early age, I realized that everybody was different. Cultures changed, communities changed, what people believed changed, what was absolute reality changed from one village to the next, never mind one country to the next. And I got very good at being adaptive, I think, and recognizing that there wasn't a way to do something or think about something. I also recognized that being smart was definitely not cool, but being good at sport was. So that was your way in, even if it was just building big swings for people, to play in the village. We also went to a Steiner school and quite often didn't go to school again. And I think when I went to a normal school, she says, for some reason my mother thought it was a good idea to go from a Steiner school to a Roman Catholic school, which is not a good idea. And my sister and I were going, oh, no, we've never played, hockey, or we've never played, netball or whatever. But we'd have played so much sport. We played so much backyard sport. We've been so active that very quickly we just ended up in every single team and did everything. And again, as I I was like, that's really curious. I wonder how come we managed to do that. And my sister was really into running. I always found it very boring. Not very good with my own company for that length of time, and she was on the Wales squad for a while, running. So she just, and we kind of knew it wasn't a natural talent. It was, we just did lots of stuff. Anyway, wind forward a little bit. I tried to get into horses, did what was an assistant instructor, which is your first qualification at that time at 16. Knew I couldn't take the qualification until I was 18, but realized I was shocked when I went to the equestrian centre. I'd never seen horses that had been locked in stables. They were supposed to be the ones that were being looked after. I just I was horrified at what I saw. It was so alien to, having my ponies wild in the field and just learning how to ride bareback and bridleless, and never had any lessons. So I thought, well, I'll go into outdoor pursuits, because clearly that's the next sensible thing to do if you're not going to be with horses. And then I ended up having a child young, which I always think was really good in hindsight, because I was doing qualifications in sports. I was doing a sport health and phys ed degree in Bangor, and I think it was a really good time to be there. So Tony Oldham was doing his PhD. Sandy Britton was in the psych department looking at dynamical systems and movement for Parkinson's patients, and how dopamine levels in the basal ganglia sort of fluctuated and either washed out or wasn't enough to do anything. So that was all really interesting, and it was a fascinating time to be there. And they were John Fazey, who was head of motor learning, motor control, was massively into understanding action systems, dynamical systems theory. So as a third year undergrad, I was already digging into Kelsall, Turvey, Colga. Not maths did then and still do make my eyes bleed, but I was just utterly fascinated. But then I had a small child who I was my lab rat, and I would always revert to what worked for him. And I think, is it Jane Clark who did the paper around?
Yes.
Yeah, her paper was just, for me, was mind blowing. I was already really, heading down that, I was trying to work out what contextual interference would be if you explained it from an ecological perspective. I don't know why I thought I'd worked that out at that time, but hey ho. And I read Jane's paper and just thought, this makes sense. This is what I'm seeing with people who I'm trying to coach to windsurf or climbing or canoeing. The sitting down in front of a computer and pressing buttons or flicking barriers over with relative time, relative force, GMP type studies made no sense at all. And I'd already decided that wasn't, it wasn't where I wanted to go, and it didn't make sense anyway. But when I read that paper, I was like, yeah, that's what I see. That makes perfect sense. And this is the way I see people developing as adults, doing new skills, especially all of the ones that I was involved with, which involve a lot of balance and dynamic balance, and being able to pick up information around about the way you're likely to move or be moved.
So it's interesting, isn't it? And if I remember rightly, and it's a long time ago, I think Joe Hudson, who was at Bangor at maybe the same time as you, or certainly were with Tony, put me across the Clark book, or the Clark and Thielen, I think it may well have been. So it was merely in the area of motor development for children, which is usually associated with children, isn't it? But you're saying that all the things that you were reading about how children develop was just the same when you were working with beginner level adults as well. So often we get the comment, oh, this works really well with kids, but it wouldn't work well with adults, or works with teams, not with individuals, or whatever. So really fascinating that the same principles that you were observing in adults, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, I can't remember, she had 8 things, didn't she, that they needed to develop in order to be able to walk. And that included, postural stability, perceptual acuity, dynamic balance. I'm trying to remember all of them.
Yeah.
And again, those were the things that I could go, yeah, that's what these people are missing. That's what they're actually always prioritizing balance. And then even as people get much more competent, and now if I'm running some of my paddling courses, one of the things that we do is we'll say, okay, let's go and put you into something that you're not used to. And quite often you take someone who's very experienced at paddling and put them on a bit of a twitchy sup board, and you see them not being able to put the paddle in properly, and they can't coordinate, and it's like they haven't forgotten how to paddle, they simply can't balance on there anymore. And balance just seems to be something that doesn't, again, it's like that fundamentals. Oh yeah, we did balance, when they were 3. let's go and tell them that they're not putting the paddle in the right place. I'm going, no, they can't balance. And the same with horse riding. People spend a lot of time, but they recognize it. They call it an independent seat. If you're not able to be balanced on a horse, then you've got no chance of being able to coordinate your hands and your legs to do anything.
So from your experiences of canoeing, riding, etc., do you think balance is transferable, or is it quite a specific to the task that you're asked to do?
So a little bit of both. So it's not transferable. Somebody who is on the slack line is not going to be able to balance climbing.
No, that study's been done, isn't it? I think.
Yeah.
Slack line to a beam doesn't transfer.
No, it doesn't transfer. And I think, when you recognize that it's a perceptual movement skill, it makes sense, because you might be able to balance your body, but you can't pick up the information that tells you, how your point of stabilization is moving. People can't ride a horse because their body can't move with the rhythm of a horse. And that's all information you're picking up, haptically.
When we've connected with the world through our feet for the majority of our lives, and now we've got to connect with the feet through our, I don't know, whether you're through your bum or whatever, or your legs. And it really is a different problem, isn't it?
Yeah. And the same with surfing, waves behave differently. However, the bit that I would say is that people who get good at finding the specifying information and searching for how to balance, and have a sense of where their body is, so they've got that good proprioceptive mapping, they can, they will pick up things quicker. And there are some basics, so in most of these sports, whether it's surfing, whether it's canoeing, whether it's skiing, if you lean back, it'll whiz out in front of you. That's a lot of beginners do, don't they? Sit back and it runs away with them. A horse kind of the same, but people will sit behind the movement on a horse, and then a nice horse won't run off with you, but it's still not, it's still
a nasty one will.
or one that can't cope with it, youngsters or something. But and it's something that even quite advanced riders use to try and absorb the movement. If they sort of like curl their lower spine and sit behind the movement, then they can just sort of, they can absorb it and not have to be directly above that, absorbing a lot of big movement.
It's one of the problems we have in coaching, I guess, is you might feel the solution, and so you start to coach from that solution. But it sounds like what you're saying is like coach the exploration to find this, so you might have that solution in your mind, but actually we need to coach exploration of search. We talked recently with Matt Wood about some of these ideas. How might we search for the type of movement that we want to get to?
It reminded me of when I was about 16, the girlfriend at the time, brother-in-law did a lot of water skiing, and we went down to Northampton to do water skiing. And I think I was first in, and he went, "Oh, just put your feet up like, your feet up like that, and it will pull you up." Well, it never did. And I'm just getting absolutely battered by the waves coming through that. And then the last one, somebody actually said, "Oh, just tip yourself up a little bit." So, now I see it's coming up now. And then, so I went for about 5 meters, fell over, and went, "Yep, that's your turn's done." I went, "Well, that was a flipping waste of time, wasn't it?" But the instruction was not, just terrible. They weren't coaches, they knew what they were doing. It will just pull you up. Well, it will if you start to move, I guess. So I really don't know. But that was my whole water skiing experience. So I have no idea whether I could balance or not. But skiing, you're right. Skiing is really interesting in terms of when I was teaching, we took the kids across to France and to Austria, and we always went to the indoor slope at Catterick. And so we went there. I'd never skied before, and you're going down on this, you're sort of going on this map. Then you get to snow, absolutely no transfer. And I was saying to Mike, who was the head of department, who'd gone every year, going, "I can't see any usefulness." He said, "No, it's really about them just putting the boots on and putting the skis on, and then we go from there." But and fascinating about how you learn to do it, isn't it? And the steps you go through as
Yeah.
a beginner. Yeah.
I've got a story for you, which I think you'll appreciate. And and again, it was one of those moments that was very memorable for me and made me think about things. And again, I guess maybe to my background, people tell me that something's absolute. My brain just goes like, okay, I'll reserve judgment on that. And you know, I was never comfortable with shutting down my son's exploration of stuff. So he used to get here. I took him to Brennan to learn to ski. So Brennan's the national alpine centre in North Wales, and there was a fabulous lady there called Charlie, who was the ski coach, and he'd have a ski lesson. I said, like, I tell you what the deal is. I'll pay for you to have a ski lesson. Then you teach me, okay, and then we'll have lunch at Brennan, walk the dog, etc. So I'm sat in Brennan watching him having his first ski lesson, you know, and it was one of those, you know, typical first ski lesson, rather boring, and they're doing like little side steps up the slope for a couple of feet, turn around and go back down, you know. It didn't take him very, and he was like whizzing down quite happily, and some of the other children were quite nervous. So Charlie was in front of them, you know, in a reverse snowplow, basically. You've seen that, you know, so she's guiding them down.
Yeah.
And so they do this for an hour, and you know, and they finish, and he sort of like, they all sort of like go up. I get my boots and stuff, and I'm like, great, okay, so your turn now. You've got to coach me what you've been doing. He takes me to the top of the ski slope. Guess what we did? Went
straight down.
Snowplow. I'm like, Sam, I think you might have missed a few bits. He's like, no.
Kids learn by imitation. Yeah.
So that's what we did. He had me reverse snowing, and he reverse snowplowed straight from the top of the ski slope to the bottom, having just been watching Charlie doing that, probably thinking that looks way more interesting than what I'm doing.
And going forward, you follow me down, Mum.
There's a theme emerging that children learning skill are more capable than we perhaps give them credit for.
Yeah, and totally. We chatting box, you know, whereas I would be like, okay, that's cool, I'll come and join in your game. I mean, and my skills improved dramatically just joining in the stuff that he did. Yeah. You know, and you know, and playing with him. And he's, you know, he's a much better skier than I'll ever be. He's a brilliant little skier. But yeah, it was just really interesting. And then I remember, you know, not too many years later I was actually watching some motorbike stunts at a show that I'd gone to take my horse to. And I've always liked my motorbikes as well. And I remember just sitting there watching them, and I turned around to my son and I said, do you know what? I bet they've never been coached. They'd have been told not to do that. Yeah. It's like uncomfortable feeling that the coaching that I was part of and that we were doing was not actually helping the skill in the sports, you know, even though there was less of it in the sports that I was involved in.
Just got to ask you an off-the-wall question, and we'll all get this as soon as I ask it. Are you an awkward person?
I try not to be, although I have to say,
I'll explain why in a minute. I'll explain why.
Yeah. You can explain why, but I also know Marianne is, so I'm not sure why you said I try not to.
I've always thought that I really look after the people I'm coaching, but I'm quite happy to be awkward upstream if I think an NGB or something else is being problematic, and especially if they're just doing the fob me off because I'm a girl. And I've definitely had lots of, you know, I discovered in mountain rescue that people are happy if I'm doing first aid, not if I'm doing the rigging. Or the you know, that's you know, so, and it's been a constant throughout my life. I think I've got better at just not being grumpy. I do remember being told by you know, when I first started working in the outdoor, being told by the first person who did any instructor training with us, basically it was like, this is really hard and I'm really, really good at it, and you're going to find it really difficult. And then get another voice in my head going like, just watch this space, you know.
I'll show you. So where it came from, we did a talk with Matt Wood, and he just said, I think I'm an awkward person, and I think this is coming out as a theme for the people who maybe adopt constraint-led approaches, who go against maybe against the traditional approaches and want to find a new way. And it's like, I think it comes from a place of, I don't like what's been going on, or I don't think this, like you're saying, I don't think this works, and I'm going to go and explore and find another way. And if that makes me, if somebody wants to call me awkward or, being, I don't know, like off the wall for that, then fine. I think that's what we are. I think that's maybe an N of 3 so far. I'm not sure how awkward you are, Will, but
yeah, pretty awkward.
Pretty awkward, yeah.
I do remember an NGB that I did work for that I was like not happy about them having VAK and learning styles as like the entire theme of the level 1 and level 2 coach awards, and they spent the whole of the first day basically talking about it, explaining it, and then identifying what learning style people were, and then the rest of it. And I really pushed back about that. I was like, right, this is this is not benign, this is actually problematic. And then the comment I got back from the NGB was, everybody else at this NGB believes in this, so you're wrong, you're outvoted. And I'm like, since when was science a popularity?
Popularity contest. All right, so we already down rabbit holes, so my fault really. When did you start coaching, and why?
Actually, when I was 16, and because I just wanted to work with horses. So like I say, I went to do my assistant instructor, which was the training, and I worked as a working pupil. So basically I lived there and I mucked the horses out and looked after and for my tuition. And I also started doing some teaching there, under supervision. So yeah, I started teaching people to ride horses at 16. And then I was kind of like, the only other thing I like are outdoor pursuits. So yeah, I had many amazing years working in outdoor centres. Just basically, my son used to say, your job's really cushy, you just take people out to play. It was kids, and then you teach adults how to play again.
Perfect job.
Yeah.
So clearly you got into you did the things that you really enjoyed and were good at, and then became a coach in those areas, effectively.
It was a way to be out and still doing those.
Stay involved.
And stay involved. Yeah.
And you talked. Sorry, Ian, go on.
Go on. No.
I was going to say, you talked about what is a fairly unique and rich history, I think, in terms of getting to the point where you're asking some questions about coaching. Not very many people land in the environment you did at university, with a young person in tow as well, to sort of to play around with some of those ideas. So it's quite a unique journey. And I wonder if that was always the way you coached, with that open mind, or was there a sort of an early coaching version of Marianne that would have been quite sort of instructional, or like, I wonder just technically what your journey was in terms of your coaching.
I think it probably would have always been like that, because like I said, I didn't go to a state school, I didn't go to any clubs, I never had any teaching of sports. But when we did go into, I played outside a lot. My parents were very much into, like say Steiner and things like that, and they kind of wanted us to just be free and play and be kids. So we did loads of stuff with them and loads of stuff on our own. So we had ponies, we had places, like say, one of the things when I was very young, I was very good at climbing trees and building swings, and if the local kids pissed me off, I just put the swings out of their way. So there was always ways of engaging. So I'd not ever had that as a child, and when I climbed and when I paddled, it was always much more about peer support and playfulness and support and helping each other, very much as it is now. So if you just think about the way people boulder or they skate, Sam skated, he was really into skating and skateboarding, and I did bits of sailing and stuff like that. So my background was much more peer support coaching.
Yeah, so really, you're almost de-schooled to some extent. You've not got the clamps of traditional approaches to schooling around you in any way. No. Do you see that as well in sort of I don't know a better term for it, so excuse me, but what seemed like sort of lifestyle sports rather than, you know, because I saw, you know, in the Winter Olympics recently, that you see a different culture, almost people congratulating each other that they've done better than each other. You know, it just feels like a really different environment for learning. Does that sort of transmit as well into your experiences?
I think definitely, and a much stronger sense of it's interdependence. You can't climb without other people around. Even the master, I joined it because I figured I'd need rescuing at some point, so I was going to put my time in up front, you know, and be part of that community. You can't go paddling safely on your own. You need other people to rescue you because they are high risk sports. You know, and our mantra was always safe, enjoyable learning in that order. You know, they need to be safe. And the bits that you do need to learn, they're absolute, will be technical stuff. But again, that needs to be, you know, I remember recently I was doing a bit of an IQA on for some coaching courses, and there was somebody candidate there who'd been taught really like, you must throw a throw line like this and you have to throw it like that. And I'm like, that's fine if you're practicing, you know, in a field, but if you're in a gorge and there's a tree in front of you, yeah, you know, it's got to hit. You've got to get someone. You need to be much more flexible than that, much more creative. You've got to be able to solve problems.
Do you think that's common to all trainers or coaches in outdoor pursuits and some of the water sports and things? Or
no, it is really interesting. So I think there is a bit of there's definitely sort of quite a dichotomy. So a lot of the instructors that I would come across were, you know, the people who had gone into it, maybe you know, it was something that they're going to do for a short period of time, and it was really good fun, and they would be, this is really hard and you won't be able to do it because you're a woman. So there's still, it's very chauvinist. There was some bits certainly 30 odd years ago that were very chauvinist. And also when you look at the numbers, there are some areas that has not improved very much.
Right.
But yeah, in terms of performance, and I think, and I don't know whether this is worth, you know, mentioning, one of the things, you know, like we come across women who are very good at stuff, you know, they would be exceptionally good. And when I spent time unpicking, you know, their sort of biography and their backstory, they would have started really young. They're doing stuff with their family. They're not being told they can't do it because they're girl. They're not being instructed in it. Then by the time they get into an environment with other people and maybe where they're being coached, they're just labeled talented. So they're allowed to sort of do their own thing. And so that always really struck me. So it was like, if you weren't talented or you hadn't had experience when you were a kid, you were assumed that you wouldn't be able to do it. So then you had to be instructed. And again, that was shutting stuff down.
I think we get that even. Sorry, go. Well,
no, I was just going to say it's interesting that sort of individual differences keeps sort of emerging in lots of these chats as well, and I wonder if we pay enough attention to that.
Yeah, I think we find that even the same approach with 6-7-year-olds. You know, some come along and they go, oh, they're just talented. They've got, you know, they're genetically gifted or whatever, but they've just been doing whatever they've been doing since they popped out the womb, really, you know, like, whereas a kid who's never done it comes along and they go, oh, we've got to teach you how to do it. And you know, that sense of playfulness has been tended to be lost, hasn't it? Whether you want to talk about a theoretical model behind it or not, we've gone away from, like you said before, with Matt, Will, we've tried to professionalize coaching with little ones when we should just be playing. You know, it's the race to the bottom, as Mark O'Sullivan would say, isn't it? It's scary and horrible and self-defeating, really. I think, you know, it just drives kids off sport very, very quickly. I'm going to have to move rooms because my battery is dead, but I'll have to go through into the other room. I'm trying to keep it. It said it had 38% before, but sorry, you'll have to edit that bit, Will, or not.
I think Ian thinks my editing skills are stronger than they are in reality.
They're going to have to be.
They're gonna have to be pretty strong.
Yeah.
Yeah. So look, moving the conversation on a little bit, and I want to. It'd be good to spend a chunk of time on equestrian coaching in particular, but I get a sense of a sort of really wide and varied background, and you mentioned Banger and you know, an integration into constraints-led approach, but could you sort of trace back how you did come across constraints-led approach, and to some extent what really got you interested in and hooked into that?
Yeah, I mean, that was quite a long time later, which was interesting because I kind of felt like I was just in a desert on my own, being awkward basically to NGVs I worked for.
Yeah.
And I did do some stuff with, so I used to do a lot of stuff with management development as well before my ex-husband's accident, and there were some really cool people there. So I remember working for Eli Lilly, one of their teams, and they were using constraints and complexity theory to understand the stuff that was going on with theirs. So I had little bits of stuff that I did, and little connections, and I went back to Bangor because I was absolutely convinced that motivation was the key, and I kept thinking about stuff with Kelsall, and you talk about, you know, cognitive structures as dissipative structures, about energetic constraints and things like that, and I was like, motivation is the thing, that's the energy into this system, you know, and it just gets missed off. I went back to Bangor and I said, right, I want to do a research master's, and I want to explore the, you know, the effects of, you know, motivational or self-determined supportive environments on skill acquisition. And then basically just looked at me as if I was completely mad. That what I hadn't realised was that they'd moved on, and it was now very much an IP place. And I was like, I'm sure this will be all right, it'll be okay. So I had two completely different supervisors, one for psych, one for motor learning. And I mean, I did it, but I ended up being pushed again into doing stuff, you know, having people who weren't passionate, so they weren't interested, they had to be. And I'm like, it doesn't matter if they've done it before, there's no such thing as, you know, motor program. Anyway, and it was when I finished that I had still wanted to complete a PhD, which I started many years ago, before my husband's accident. And so I started looking around, and I just thought, I've got to the age where I am not, you know, I'm not interested in not doing exactly what I want. It doesn't matter where it is. It's much more important that I've got people who are sort of on the same page and doing the same thing. So then I started doing some research, and I came across, you know, started to come across the idea of the constraints-led approach, which was a way of basically structuring practice and coaching, underpinned by and you know, and also ecological dynamics, so direct perception. I was aware of some of James Gibson stuff, and Eleanor Gibson and Karen, you know, again into motor development more. And then I just did a wish list. I just picked the people, and I thought Keith Davies was in Australia for some reason still, so I didn't do my research that well, did I? Did a wish list, and I thought, I'm just going to email people until somebody says yes, just see how far I get down my list. And Keith David said yes, and then I went, I want to do it with horses rather than, but I'll go adventure sports if you absolutely can't deal with that. Yeah, so cool. And then I realized that I've been playing, and actually I'd started playing with, you know, very much the principles of a constraints-led approach unbeknown, because my when I did leave my husband, my full-time job was working at Surflines in Llanberis, and they brought me in because they needed somebody who had at least some academic background, because they'd got a contract to run the sports science and outdoor ed degree there. So they needed somebody who could run the water-based practical and do the sort of, you know, set assignments, mark, etc., right, learning outcomes, all that kind of stuff. And then, but I was coaching, and a lot of the time I was, you know, we would coach these students for years, and some of them would arrive really good, and some of them had never been in a boat before. You know, so, and I realized that the people who were really good, I was never going to be able to take them out in really hard water. Well, we couldn't anyway, and I wasn't qualified to, and I'd probably die, you know. So I got incredibly good at being creative. And, you know, and I'm like, I can make any water very hard. I can set activities that are completely differentiated. You know, I'd have a big toy box full of stuff. I'd have, you know, put them on cushions so that destabilizes them. I get them, you know, towing things to add, or just, you know, play games like polo where they had conversions, but to do a conversion they had to do something like, you know, a hand roll or something if they were really good, or something nice and simple if they weren't, to get points. So I just got really good at creating games that allowed them to progress and have fun with the limitations of venues, bad weather, and my ability, their ability, the kit we had. I just need to get as creative with that with the horses now, and I'll be all right.
Nice. Well, look, it's a good segue. I think the notion of designing environments is pretty close to our hearts. So it's interesting to hear about that. I do a bit of work with equestrian qualifications through University of Gloucestershire, so I'm fascinated in terms of where we go with the next set of questions. But the thing that always strikes me is you've got two athletes, that the horse and the rider in this world, that we seem to approach quite differently in terms of how we design their environment for learning, and one is so sort of closely intertwined with the other. I just wondered if you could give us a bit of an overview of that in some ways, you know, how you think about designing environments for horse and rider.
I've dropped my video out. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, can hear you.
Yeah.
I don't know if you got my last question. It was more of a ramble than a question, but
you started talking about it being two completely different species, basically, two organisms.
Yeah, so I guess my question and my interest is in how you sort of manage and what that looks like in terms of coaching in an environment where you've got two different species that actually you need to connect so much. You know, they really have to learn together in some instances.
Put it another way, do you coach the rider, or do you coach the horse, or do you just presume that the rider controls the horse? Or, I mean, I've got no idea, so I'm fascinated to hear. So
I've always described, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I've always described coaching equestrian sports as basically being a coach developer, because you're coaching the rider to coach the horse and learn at the same time. And I think, again, with my background in adventure sports, one of the things that a theme that it started to come through very strongly early on was that people tend to come, you know, they either come to have a go because they've never done it before and it's like a family holiday, splash and dash kind of thing, or they come because there's something that they're struggling with. And it's usually recreational. You know, I don't tend to work with elite paddlers. It's great. Like, but these recreational, you know, performers are often doing stuff that's really hard, really high level as well. And so they need to be able to be independent. There's no point, you know, running a session where I just tell them answers that they can't then go and instigate elsewhere, you know. So again, it needs to be around supporting them to become problem solvers, whilst also managing motivation. And I think Tony used to say this, you know, you put this, and we used to do it in management stuff, you put the hard stuff in the middle. So the bit that you're going to work hard on goes in the middle. You spend the first bit getting to know them, making sure that you know, goal setting, exploring, paying attention, watching, listening. Put the hard stuff in the middle, and then, you know, you don't ask someone to run something big or do something hard at the end of the session, which coaches do tend to do, because they think, oh, this is a grand finale, and you're like, yeah, but if it goes wrong, you can't unpack it. You know, these people are losing confidence because they're dependent on you, and scare the life out of them at the end. Anyway, I've gone off track a little bit. So there were lots of things that are very similar, and it is both. But again, I worked as search dog for years as well, so I spent lots of time with dog, or pretty much always had horses, and they are incredibly intelligent. They connect. It's like, you know, again, when I looked at stuff like, you know, synchronicity, horses are synchronous with each other. if you walk next to them and you you mimic their front legs and then speed, lengthen and shorten, they kind of join in. It's almost like, sort of from an evolutionary perspective, they're so tuned in to movement and emotion, so.
Well, and you just look at their change of gait, I guess, from walk to trot to canter to gallop. I've got that the right way around.
Yeah, and that's where I first heard about phase transitions, was Kelsol's stuff on.
Yes.
We came at a point of instability. And I'm like, that was probably why I got into it. Like, Kelsol was like, I love this.
Yeah, well, look, and I think they are almost a perfect species to talk about those phase transitions. But having had a father who was in the military mounted police and been around a very instructional coaching environment, because it was almost sort of behaviorist 101 with horses, instruct them like that. Like, does that still exist? And how does that marry up with your sort of perspective on constraints? I find them quite a dynamical ecological being. They're almost my start point for talking about this with undergraduate students. Is, look, here you have a beast that changes pace changes its gait depending on the sort of demands of the environment, yet we tend to instruct them. So how does that marry up?
Great question, and it's probably the next sort of challenge that I'm sort of trying to get my teeth into, because, as you say, there's quite an extreme behaviorist perspective of horses are just stimulus response creatures, and so if you train them so that you condition them so if you press this button this will happen. And that has lots of issues, and there's some research coming out, showing that even riders who understand, behaviorist theories and apply them, it doesn't increase either welfare or safety. And I'm like, yeah, that makes sense to me. Because it's still too human centric, and they're not considering the horse as having any kind of skill or intentionality. And there's a million rabbit holes we could go down, so I'm going to try not to. But if you just think from so I go, actually, there's probably two things that for me are the most important in the horse and rider dyad, and that's that both, including the horse, are acting or are moving with self-determined motivation. Okay, so it doesn't have to be intrinsic, it can be extrinsic, but it needs to be self-determined. In other words, they are moving with intentionality. The horse is trying to go there over that, not being constrained and pushed. The other one is that they are able to self-organize. And understandably, there's a couple of things that are sort of problematic at the moment in terms of the probably mostly social cultural constraints, the way things have always been done. There's thousands of years of history with equestrian sports or just with horses, and a lot of them come from a place that's either military or utilitarian. And times, when I said to other people where they didn't think that women had agency or should have agency or concern, people were fighting to survive and horses were part of that fight. But the interesting bit is that pretty much everyone involved in the equestrian world that I come across, and I know that there'll be exceptions, there are everywhere, genuinely, passionately love their horses. And being with them is so integral to their life. And I understand it would be like somebody cutting off, like taking my family away, that there's something so precious about being able to connect, even if it's just those little interactions with animals. I think for us it's really important as a species. We are animals, we've evolved with other animals. To be disconnected from them is really impoverishes certainly my life. But we need to make sure that being with them doesn't impoverish their lives, that can still be enriched. And
sorry, I was fascinated by the emotion comment of you work with them through emotion.
Yes.
How?
They just, I kind of go, they read intent. I,
Right.
I think I'm trying to think of a good example. So recently, my son came down and with his new dog. It's a rescue dog, who's still struggling with all sorts of things as they do, and you know, horses can smell pheromones, they pick up stuff, they can hear our heart rate from something like 10, I can't remember if it's 10 feet or 10 meters, it's a long way away. They can hear it, they know what's going on. They connect emotionally. So they pick, you know, when we talk about affordances and perception information, we have no idea what they're connecting to, you know. So when you go there and you're like, I'm going to try and think good thoughts, the horse is like, what's going on, you know. You know, and I get grumpy when people go, oh, if I get really stressed, you know, my neuro-linguistic programmer coach has said I've just got to, you know, think about that fabulous holiday in Greece and whatever. And I'm like, the last thing you want is for you to go off to Greece, because they're going to know. Do you know what I mean? They're going to, where are you? You should be here. But they understand. They totally understand. And the bit that I wish I'd videoed was my dog racing into the field, barking, my collie, and like showing off, you know, like, look, these are my horses, I'm going to round them up for you. And he's yapping and he's jumping up at them, and they're just like, oh, look, it's Snoopy. And as their dog came into the corner of the field, completely still, didn't move a muscle, and all four horses were like that. You're thinking bad thoughts, you know, and that we had to whisk him out, because the Shetlands particularly went for him. They just drove him, all four of them drove him out the field.
Wow.
And you know, so when people, you know, I know they use them sometimes in management development, don't they? It's sort of leadership stuff, which feels a little bit unfair, because we know leadership's also it's also context dependent.
Yeah.
They kind of know. They know if you're confident, they know if you're comfortable, they know if you and if you pick up information. So just as I'm sure you could walk into a room and you know if your children are upset or your wife is, or something's happened.
Yeah, she hits me usually, so I know when she. No, just joking.
Alison uses a behaviourist approach with Ian.
Yeah. When you spend time with horses, you are so attuned to them as individuals, you know. And if you don't know them, and certainly if you don't know the horses, then you can't be. You just are not tuned to that perceptual information.
So I put a challenge to you, and I'm about to venture into a world I know absolutely zero about. So I will. That's the caveat. But you see the development of really skillful horses. I'm sort of thinking of the what they call is it Lipizzaner, the Austrian horses, or the Andalusian horses in Spain, where they're highly skillful. Yeah. Like how is that? You know, there's a challenge there for us, isn't there? If you can be really successful in developing skill, but there's these other ways of doing things as well. So what's your view? Again, like I've used some words there, probably I still don't know if I've got them right.
Again, I think one thing that's probably worth recognizing is that there isn't just one way of training horses and one way of being with horses. There are, you know, those forms of life around either different sports, different countries, different things that are hugely different and nuanced. And there are certainly lots of cultures where you know, they understand a deep connection with their horses. You know, the whole idea of a centaur is so central to most horse sports, and children learn to ride just by, you know, being left to come play with their ponies, like I did, you know, off you go. You know, and so that sense of embodied cognition of being part of another animal, I mean, it is the most intimate thing you can do, apart from, you know, the relationship you have with your partner, being connected to an animal, doing stuff over that period of time. And so that's really integral. There's often sort of a bit of conflict, you know. You talked about, I mean, earlier you asked about, you know, some of the adventure sports and coaches, and I know some coaches who will deliver coach development or coach education the way they're supposed to, but then when they coach, they're amazing, they don't do anything, there's no connection between the two at all. You know, and so there are some horse cultures where, you know, they do incredible things and they recognize that to do that. But the other sad thing is that horses, you know, you can force them to do stuff. People say, oh, you can't make an animal this size do what you want to, but people do with learned helplessness, force, shut them down. You know, they don't necessarily thrive. When you look at the places where they probably do better, so like say in Portugal, my understanding is those horses tend to spend the first couple of years of their lives up in the mountains, just wild in families, you know, doing multi-skills, getting really resilience and anti-fragile and all of those things, you know, having really good relationships. But the way in which they're worked is really well managed, and they always get, you know, they take the shoes off and tip them out for a good time every year, you know, so they're not, I think we've got more problems in modern times where horses spend too much time just locked up in a very small space, and then they come out and they do very repetitive stuff, and they're not allowed to go and run around because they might hurt themselves. And so, you know,
play is still important, even with another species.
Yeah. So anyway, we keep wandering off the topic actually of that, but when I'm coaching, it's both, like I say, because those two things are so important, and balance. We go back to that balance thing. The biggest issue for horses is balance. If they're carrying a rider, you know, they're not going to, you know, riders want them to look beautiful, but actually they've just got to like get the hang of balancing again with somebody on them. And riders, the biggest, you know, beginner riders, their position and stuff that they're doing needs to be about learning to balance on a moving horse. And so the way in which they would sit and would be really different to an elite rider. And I'm actually, I mean, at the moment, I'm really experimenting, and again, ending up going completely the opposite to sort of the stuff that I was taught even. You know, a lot of learning to balance on a horse is take your stirrups away so you sit, and you try and sit deep into the horse and then be perfectly straight and like look symmetrical. And I'm like, well, and push your heels down. I'm like, but there's nothing under your heels, there's just air, you know. And so I, you know, now and it's making a huge difference. If I'm coaching, I'm like, off your seat. I'm going to, you know, like I use constraints, I confiscate the seat. You can't sit down. Like, now you need to balance over your stirrup, over your foot, you know, the balls of your feet. And that gives you your stable lower leg, because if you're just balancing in the middle, you just pivot around, you know, the horse stops and just go plop, or, you know, and you're wobbling, and, you know, because you've switched off all of your postural stabilizing muscles because you're trying to stay still. You know, so yeah, completely different. You know, I get people carrying little weights in their hands and things and moving them around, you know, as much, you know, perturbation on their system to get it back into a point of balance as won't annoy the horse. And the same with the horse, you know, uneven ground, up and down hills, corners.
So you don't teach this is how to sit on a horse. You just put them on the horse and say, find your balance point, or explore that, or. Yeah,
I mean, I haven't taught beginners for a while. I do a bit, but yeah, with beginners, I tend to do, I call it passenger lessons. And the important bit is so they're learning to pick up the rhythm of a horse. But I think one of the things that's really important, again, this is well known in horse culture, but there are some issues going forward, is that if you're learning to ride a horse, you get a really experienced horse. And if you're a really experienced rider, you can bring on inexperienced horses. We've got a bit of a culture now where lots of people go out and buy themselves a completely green horse and decide they're going to learn to ride with their horse. And I compare that to like having two complete beginners in an open canoe, you know. So they've got no idea whether what they're doing is causing the problems or the good results, or if it's that. It's just a really unstable, and there's no, it's not a valid learning environment in terms of you're going to get feedback about what you've done and how effective that's been. So it's really difficult to learn, but also that it really quickly unravels because horses get scared easily, you know,
right.
Animals, you know, so their emotions it's really important to manage their emotional state. So a horse that, you know, schoolmaster, a horse that's done a lot, will be able to stabilize their movement with a rider and still have rhythm and balance. And so the rider's able to learn to ride and pick that up. And
there is that sort of level of co-adaptation. They're almost sort of saying, well, you don't quite get this, so I'm going to change my movement a little bit to make it. You almost see it that starkly, do you?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, horses do. I mean, a lot of horses, all the braciness, and then the other things to get told off for them, just trying to co-adapt and cope with a, rider being stiff or a weight or holding on too tight to, the mouth or whatever they're doing. I mean, it's like you trying to do stuff and somebody's like tied your hands behind your back, and then the whole, and the horse is desperately still trying to complete the activity, dealing with, whatever they've got on top. So, and again, all equestrian sports will say that ultimately the role of the rider is to get out of the horse's way, to allow the horse to move underneath them. But skilled riders do stabilize horses' movements as well, in that a skilled rider can help create rhythm. And having some, just from yourselves in terms of, sort of transitions and attractor states, sometimes adding speed or adding weight stabilizes patterns. So you can stabilize as well as destabilize by riding.
It's like on a bike, isn't it? I think it's more stable if you go faster.
You go, exactly.
It's when you're first starting, it's when you're too slow, it's really unstable, and you've got lots of degrees of freedom going. And this is fascinating. And I mean, if you drew, I think, did you draw the analogy earlier that the rider is the coach and the horse is the athlete? So is it a similar relationship? So what have you drawn from your work in equestrian, that when I'm working with people, in terms of the role of the coach when you're working with a human rather than a horse, where you're trying to coach the human? Because it sounds like it's still it's all about building a relationship. It's massively based on emotion, and I think we overlook that as a constraint on terms of the coaching athlete relationship. It's a relationship. It's got to be based on emotion. And I'd really enjoyed reading some stuff around affective pedagogy for the new nonlinear pedagogy book, and Rowan Jones, is it, up at Leeds now? And
Robin Jones. Oh no.
Robin Jones. No, Rowan. Is it Rowan?
Rowan, yeah.
And Dave Piggott's work around some of the stuff around coaching there and creating emotionally engaging environments, which I love the whole concept. Basically going back to play, really.
Yes.
So how does your work in your equestrian impact on your work as a coach developer, say, or as a coach yourself working with humans?
I think it's a good question. It's a really good question.
Sorry, too long.
No, it's fine, because I think we go backwards and forwards, because like to make the leap to go, okay, we can apply this to equestrian sports. I think I at least needed to recognize there was something familiar. But the key bits again would be around the fact that although you're coaching, or a rider's still coaching the horse, it is really, it's very much still got to be a partnership and a collaboration. Sometimes I go, you just got 51% vote, or I'm navigating, but you can decide, how you can do it, kind of thing. So that bit of it in there. And also I think the other thing that is a really big similarity is just not assuming you understand that lived experience. We can't do it with a horse, but for some reason we think we can with with a human being, and we can't do it with a child. I can't even remember my child being a child, never mind me. And so I think those are the things that are really important, is recognizing that it is an interaction, and that you pay attention to the emotion, what's going on, the energy that they're putting into it. And be sensitive to that. And I think when you work around animals, you become very attuned to energy and connection. I know if somebody's disconnected. I know if my horse is disconnected or my dog's disconnected. Even my search dog, I could tell like 200 meters away if he disconnected and he was going to go and chase a rabbit or something before it happened. You can almost feel it snap. But you become more sensitive, I think, to things like that. So I think those are the things that in coaching, coach development, it is remembering that it's not just telling somebody else what you think your answer is and assuming that you understand their experience. That's what's a good place to start.
Want to get into building on that and how you might implement CLA in equestrian coaching, but I'll come to that because you just mentioned coach development there, and one of our sort of questions to folk in this space really, and we'll ask it of you as well, is how important is the sort of that the theoretical grasp? You talked loads there about emotion and other aspects here. Are you using some of that theory to work in the coach development space? Like, how important is it? How hard is it?
In terms of the theory, ecological dynamics,
and constraints and
constraints, massively important, and with all of the stuff. And actually, even, you know, I find myself thinking really hard around, you know, what actually makes a good learning experience, and how do we increase behavior, you know, how do we help behavior change through skill development of coaches and coach developers. So I work with coach developers as well, you know, who are going to develop the coaches. You know, and I've been around long enough to recognize there's been lots and lots and lots of things done and projects, and then nothing actually changes. You know, the basin of
translation is poor, isn't it?
It's still all the same problems, all the same issues in sport that there were 30 years ago after all this effort. And so part of what I think about is like actually the really important, and I'm, you know, and this is just me experimenting, and also people I work with. I mean, I've worked with an incredible team. How do we create a different attractor basin, basically? And what does that look like? And this is even more important with the horses, because otherwise we're going to lose them. They'll get banned, you know, if everyone's too busy denying we're being pushed to the top of this, you know, this metastable state place where other people actually want to get rid of them completely. You know, so we need to create somewhere to go to and think about what are the bits of the system that will enable that to happen. And it's not just sending someone on another course and telling them something about a different theory.
Yeah, I mean, you're right, aren't you? That if I think about the journey of coaches, will have had everything thrown at them. You know, this is the new way, the new way, the new way, the new way.
Another one.
Yeah. How is it landing? Like, how, you know, I'm almost thinking of your work with UK coaching here. You know, what are the conversations like with things like some complex theory? You know, this is one that we're attracted to, but I'm sure in your role you have to get them to think about lots of other different things as well, you know. So how does that land? How do those theoretical conversations land?
I have them at different levels with different people, obviously, and my team are actually really good, but they're like, okay, just like, I need to know what's inside your head, and then we can translate it into something that we can use and make practical, which they're also brilliant at doing. But essentially, I think there's pretty much, from UK coaching's perspective, like CLA, they're going, actually, we need this, and the principles. And again, I think both with youth and with horses, and this is one of the reasons why I think Keith Davies said yes, and why Mark O'Sullivan, you know, and Stu and I have such great conversations, is there are parts of it that are really, really important in terms of welfare, as well as skillfulness, whether you're talking about a horse or a child. You know, once you start insisting that everybody does the same thing, that has problems, you know, or being obedient, that has problems, or having an idea that there is a way to do something and you're going to tell them, you know. And so there's a really deep ethical bit that sits underneath it. And for me, that was one of the reasons why it was really important for me to do this with the equestrian, you know, with equestrian sports. Yeah, and that's, you know, even just that, you know, so I did the podcast with Mia Palliser-Clark and Stu not long ago, but, you know, if a horse can't say no, saying yes is meaningless, you know, ditto for a child. And that I think is one of the things that's really important. So within UK coaching, there's a recognition also that everything's changing and that sports might not look the same in 2, 3, 4 years time as they do now. So how do we support coaches and coach developers to be working in another environment, to support athletes to be working in maybe another environment, to still be able to be skillful, but more importantly, to have that welfare front and central.
That's brilliant. These conversations don't always go where we think they're going to go, which is brilliant as well. They're very emergent. And I mean, I think that is absolutely right. And the whole integrative model is, considering the psychology, the physiology, the nutrition, whatever. And therefore the ethics and the welfare are key to it all, aren't they? Really deep down. And I guess that's one of the reasons why we feel so strongly about the approach, is that if we give a one size fits all, I don't know what the current dropout, the dropout in junior sport is phenomenal. And I think somebody in AFL told me that less than 1% of the kids who play Auskick, which is the introductory form of AFL, are still playing at 18. Well, is that a successful program? Well, what we've done is hook them onto the sport. We've given them a scarf, and they go and support the local team for the rest of their lives, which, is a win for a sport in some ways. But really, we want to be still wanting them to play sport if we believe sport is important and an activity, which we obviously do because we're in it. Then we're not being successful in what we're doing, and we've got to change it. Anyway, we get back on our awkward bandwagon really as we're going forward here. But I think that it's really powerful, that, Marianne. Thank you. Yeah. You've got the questions, Will, because I'm now.
Yeah, no, you're all right. I just don't. Stop me if I'm talking too much, Ian. I think if we move on to sort of implementing, you talked earlier about slowing and speeding up, and I'm sort of drawn to some of the conversations I've had with equestrian coaches in the last couple of years, practice design and jumps, and where to put jumps, and when to sort of change pace, and how we get the rider and the horse to experience that. So look, there's a bit of framing, but I guess the question is around what are the key principles for implementing constraints in equestrianism? How do you mess around with the environment? I guess the question is.
So again, and I'm sure Will, you can comment on this. I think the use of constraints is very, very well utilized, and I mean by lots of them, rather than from a constraints-led perspective. So equestrian sports, because you can't talk to the animal, constraints are used a lot, whether that's in equipment, forcing a horse into a particular shape, or in practice design. It's not well used from a constraints-led perspective. Although the thing that I'm finding fascinating, and perhaps again, Will, you've probably experienced this, is that the equestrians connect to the whole concept very easily. I used to think paddle sports were great because I could talk to them about weather and fluid dynamics, and they're like, yeah, we get that, but the perception action coupling bit they weren't quite so good at. Whereas the equestrians, once you start talking to them about that, perceptual attunement to their horses, they're like, yeah, of course I know that, and like you say, gait, coordination dynamics of gait, in transitions in quadrupeds is a classic place to start exploring, self-organization movement systems. So there's masses of stuff that they connect to, which is really good. But what and so some of it is actually just about tweaking. One of the problems, though, is that it's been influenced by this information processing idea of a perfect ideal technique. So it's practices like wrapping, which is like, hitting the horse's front legs as it goes over a jump, are used because people think that helps the horse, I mean, yeah, like, but that's like, like having a monster grabbing a kid's ankles as they jump into the bed at night, it just freaks them out, doesn't it? It's like, it's not supposed to be there. That's not good perception action coupling support. So it's a misunderstanding of how horses move, and they think, well, if I train the horse to make the right shape physically, and then I tell it when to do something, then that's job done. Like I said, it was very different from thinking of the horse as being, a you know, having autonomy and decision making and perceiving the world through their senses and their body and their action capabilities at that moment in time. And so and again, I'm not as good with this as I am with my paddling, because I had to adapt with my university students. I had no choice, you know. It wasn't because I was, you know, I was smart or anything. I was surviving. But one of the biggest problems is lack of movement variability, and I started to lean a little bit into the stuff with the athletic skills model and go, what would those basic movements be for a horse? And they include rearing, striking, kicking, biting, all of those other things, you know. And how can we help horses make sure that they're regularly going through their full repertoire of movements? Clearly, lots of them without us on them. There's a lot of stuff we don't want them to do with us or with us on them, but how do we start to create that? So that's one bit of it, using constraints to design a horse's environment. Or, you know, I work my horses loose or on a lunge quite a lot, and they never do it in a school anymore. You know, they're in long grass because it means they pick their feet up and they bend and flex their hocks. They're on steep slopes, so they have to bring their weight back again, so they don't, you know, they don't end up doing like James Rudd's gallop down there. You know, I'm going, no, walk. I'm like, oh, steep. Changing ground, walking on angles, lumpy ground they can't see where they're going to put their feet down, so they have to maintain. They take the slack out of the muscle. You know, if you think about Franz Botcher's stuff that he does, you know, make sure that they're not tense, but they're holding enough muscle tone. Yeah. Start building up and moving and making much more connections and becoming, you know, being able to move much more freely, but also moving with intention. You know, there's a game, there's an activity. I bring other horses in. So constraints wise, I often bring another horse, because then it's fun and they like, you know, they do stuff together. And again, probably doing lots of stuff that no one else would normally do. You know, I've got my riders with one hand carrying weights, not allowed to sit down, shut their eyes on the way up to a jump so they can feel the horse, changing the jumps a lot at lower level so that the horse has got multiple ways of getting out of it. I want my horses to learn how to stop. I want my horses to be able to dodge safely, because lots of horses end up being put down because they've tried to duck out to the jump they cannot make. But ducking out is dangerous because they're not skillful at ducking out. Yeah, so all of those things that probably most coaches would go, what are you doing?
Yeah, I think that you're sort of given an opportunity to create a skillful mover, aren't you? And I'm drawn to Newell's stuff. In my sport, it's quite easy to manipulate task constraints. I think you've got a really nice part of the triangle with the organism in equestrianism, where you can play around. You know, we talked about lots of repetition without repetition, so stride length in jumps and things like that, where they've actually got to work out, okay, if I slow down, I can be successful. If I change my angle, I can be successful.
Do you have...
Go on.
No, go on, carry on.
I was just going to say one more bit with that, actually. Don't forget your question in.
No.
One of the things that I used to be taught to do, and quite a lot of coaches do, is that we've got to get this perfect canter for big jumps, but we do it on the flat or with small jumps. You know, my horses are going on, I can step over that. Why should I do a great canter? You know, I don't see the point. So what I've started doing now is I put the jumps up to the point where they change. They go through a phase transition and they put a bit more power in the canter. And then I work there at that metastable. So I don't try and make them do, you know, what's a dysfunctional jump over a shape, over a small jump. I just pop them up till they're doing what I want them to do, and then I can stop there. I don't have to make it huge. I just need to be at that point where actually they realize that they're not going to get over it unless they actually sit on the haunches and bounce the canter a bit more.
Yeah. Do they pick that up, or do they pick up the difference in height? Or
yeah, they do it themselves.
Which would be like, I mean, that's an affordance, isn't it? Why wouldn't they pick up affordances and realize what they need to do to get out? So it's intentionality again.
Build intentionality.
So you know that I remember as a kid watching. I mean, it used to drive me mad because it usually went to equestrian when there was a test match on or something, and you're going, I want to watch the test match. I don't want to watch this. But is it Hicks did, where they went up that bank and had to walk along the other side or whatever. So, I mean, that's a really interesting. I was in my mind, I was thinking about if you're out running and you came to a stile or you came to a wall that you'd never seen before, and as you're approaching it, you're picking up the information. You've got to make a decision at some point where do I try and jump right over it? Am I going to jump up and take one step on it and go over? Or do I actually have to get up on it and just stop and jump down? Or do I just stop completely and climb up it? You know, so there's all this information you're picking up as you're coming to it. And of course, that means understanding awareness of yourself and your effectivities at that moment in time, as well as, you know, how my legs are massively fatigued. I've just done 20 miles or whatever, and I'm not going to do it anyway. So the horses have got to be aware of those and pick all that sort of things up. So that's pretty cool. I'm just wondering if sometimes when we're working with students or with new coaches and we get them to do the triangle and they say, well, what are the individual constraints that might be important in your sport? What are the task constraints? What are the environmental constraints? Do you do that for the horse rider system? Or do you do two separate triangles, one for the rider, one for the horse?
I actually do. I do both, although it's more of it for the system. But the and this was interesting because the feedback that Duarte Araggio gave me from the concept paper was that you need to keep them as a system. So even if the horse doesn't want the rider on them, they're still actually operating as a system until they buck you up or whatever. It's still a system. And so, but the obviously the horse is experiencing it differently. You know, they're experiencing in a different way to the rider. And I think one of the areas where it would be really fascinating, really important to do some research, and I'd love to do some as a postdoc, is understanding what information horse is picking up, because there's no research being done on that. In eventing, the idea is the horse jumps because you told it to, and it has to trust the rider. It's so utterly, ingrained into that sport that the horse shouldn't be making a decision about whether something is jumpable or not. And to make it safer, they've just put frangible pins so that when the horse hits a jump, it's less likely to have a rotational fall. And I'm just going, we just need to understand what information horses are picking up and understand things like those action boundaries. Horses, because most competitions, that's where they're playing, aren't they? They want that boundary where the horse is like, well, I could do it, but I might not be able to. And so there's the indecision. When it's easier, they know they can jump it. When it's really hard, they know they can't. But you see the action boundary. Is that what you call it?
Yeah.
Call it action boundary. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's that bandwidth of the affordance, isn't it? Of what's within here, I can do it.
Yeah, where it's close to where it may or may not be possible, then they need to spend time with information.
I think we make the same decision on behalf of our athletes and our children and our learners. Like it's very similar, I think.
Definitely. Well, I mean, it's like, Danny, how much of a gap do you leave between the defenders and try and invite the attacker to make the pass through, knowing that, like, you're the Venus flytrap, and how big do we have to make it for it to still be able to get it, rather than I
was drawn to the idea as you were talking about the coach on the sideline that says you must play at match pace, even though nothing in the system is requiring you to play at match pace. It's that sort of similar idea, isn't it?
Yeah,
definitely. Yeah,
like the athlete, the horse is attuned to, well, I don't need to, so why would I? And then they get whipped and spurred and hassled, and it's just like, this pointless. Why don't you just, if you give it a purpose, just give it a purpose, put another horse in there, have a race. If you want them to do a big canter, take them uphill or downhill and something, and get them to race a friend, but give that movement a purpose.
I remember a friend doing some 1v0 drills in football, and I'm going, how can you? No, we've got to simulate it at match pace, the turn or the move. You're going, yeah, but you don't have to. It's like false, isn't it? There's no reason to do it, so why would we do it? It's incredibly fascinating. But
I'm really drawn to it with the equestrian sport because there's no way out. You know, I can't go and just tell them. I can't have
well, I wonder, you know, the analogies or the similarities here are with Karen Adolph's and you know, all the work in motor development with babies, where you can't communicate that way as well. So you need your own version of the slope or the, you know, the glass wall, the glass edge or whatever. So you need to go and look at Karen Adolph's and get, I don't know, foals and you know, do they crawl down here or do they walk or do they, I don't know. I've no idea really. But
no, it's fascinating stuff though. For really cool. Like we had an undergrad student a couple of years ago do beam walking with beginner gymnasts, and same width beam, but their skill changed completely when you raised the beam to a certain height.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
That perception, like you almost need to do something like that with horses, don't you, to build on Ian's point? I think there would be.
What are the control parameters? What are the control parameters? And
exactly.
I know there's also
you're stealing. I just need somebody to pay me to do it. But
of course. I mean, a lot of the analogies were similar to what I was thinking about with Matt Wood, where you know, he's doing hurdle coaching. So you've got to get them to be able to jump in a confined space between two hurdles. Well, you've got combinations, you know, and it's the same thing. And he would say he'd be measuring out stride lengths and then adjusting the hurdles closer and further away and manipulating that and finding those critical values or critical points and squeezing them up to the final version. When you do that, I guess that sounds like what you're doing with that, adding that variability piece in with the horses, where you might have a high one, a low one, it's a long way apart, short part. You know, it's pretty cool ways of training them, isn't it?
I still
you still a lot of ideas.
I still lots of ideas from Matt and from people who do hurdling or triple jump.
But why not? You know, and I'm sure they're stealing ideas from you as well. So, anyway.
But yeah, it's very similar. And in competitions, at different levels of competition, there are different sizes to jumps. You know, speed over the ground, optimal time, distances between. So the combination jumps like hurdles, you can have triple jumps, you know, doubles and triples, where there is a set space.
Right.
Would just lengthen and shorten within those spaces. And they change, you know, and the shapes that are made and in the course change, the complexity, the speed of moving from one jump to another. And the horses learn these. I mean, they're incredible. You often, you know, watch horses that ride has fallen off and they just carry on jumping. You know, they know the type of action that's likely to be, you know.
The other one that made me think as well, the similarities was when teaching your athletes to, when they hit a hurdle, to roll. He was saying they did army rolls, so that when they hit the hurdle, they had a bailout. They knew how to convert. And that sounds like your avoidance of, if I can't do it, I've got to get out of here. I've got to bail out quick, and giving them that skill.
Yeah, and like I said, they do it with people. They acknowledge that people might, you know, not be able to make something or hit it. I mean, horses don't roll very well because they're too big and too heavy, and you don't want them rolling. And yet that seems to be preferable to them being able to dodge out. And you know, sometimes when I listen to, you know, more traditional coaching or to commentary on TV, I'll be like, ah! You know, so you've got somebody going, oh, that was very naughty, that event horse ducked out of there, that rider needs to take it back and really show it what that whip on the outside shoulder means, and ensure that it's obedient. And I'm like shouting at the TV going, you think that a perfect jump was the only other option, the only other possible thing that could happen at that moment in time? Might have been a rotation ball.
In horse racing, when the horses are like in steeplechase or whatever, and you're talking about that entrainment where they get into rhythm together and they come to a hurdle, and you know, I guess there's going to be a reasonably optimal distance that the horse is going to want to jump from to get over that hurdle. But if their horses are very different, I don't know how different they are, But if one's got a greater spring or a bigger leg length or whatever, that could be different. Now, how do you decouple in that situation? Or
I don't
whatever?
know. I want to ask Araji or somebody to help me have a look at some footage and just see if he can, you know, do a bit of his
Well, you could.
modeling.
I mean, a lot of it is
Modeling,
you go
yeah.
back to like our work on long jumping,
Yeah.
which would fit with, you know, with running up to the hurdle. If you start measuring step lengths and you look at whether they use tau or whether they use, you know, like where do they start to regulate their step lengths in relation to the hurdle? So you just measure it in exactly the same way, wouldn't you? You'd work it back and you'd look at, is there a, you know, a fall off, or how are they visually regulating here? It'd be the same study, I think, really.
Yeah, I think so. And then you go, actually, if you want jump racing to be safe, these are just some of the rules around, you know, making sure your horses are X distance apart, or that they're not, you know, so that you know. Yeah. Because at the moment, just those things, just that they're not being done yet. I think people recognize that happens. They recognize the horses, like say, in train, but it's just like the research is yet to be done. There's masses. I just think there's so much. And also, you know, Will, I talk to the students, you know, that have done the course with you, and they're so passionate. They're so, you know, about all the stuff, the doors that it opens. And Andrew McLean, who sort of like heads up equitation science, which, you know, has always been very heavily behaviorist. Just, I mean, he's never heard of this. He's like, oh my goodness, you've just like opened this door to this really exciting space that's got pieces of the jigsaw that are clearly missing for us. You know, those were the words he used. And you know, and I think it's just not being introduced yet into the horse world. I think most people, once they start looking into it, just like go, oh, you know, like we've been doing this kind of thing, but maybe there are things that will support us.
Yeah, I think the thing I really enjoy working with the students on that course at Gloucestershire is they've got better questions, you know, like I might present like this could be a thing, and they're like, wow, yeah, but actually these are the questions you really need to ask about ... So there's a nice synergy between saying that you might ask some questions and them having some really good questions to ask, which I quite enjoy.
And you know, the conversations I've had, the questions are incredible. Well, it was supposed to be a lecture demo, but it wasn't, sort of a seminar and a interactive session with Nikki Fuller and the Connected Equestrian Coaches group. Yeah, that's the right one, isn't it?
With Jane, isn't it?
Yeah, the questions they were asking were phenomenal. The conversations, you know, that these, I mean, even like Mia, who hasn't done Your Love, no, she did do it.
Yeah, just done, I think, just finished.
Yeah, she just finished. The conversation they were having, I was astounded at the nuance and the, you know, and just how much they understood, and you know, the conversation they're having with each other around, you know, what perceptual information was representative, what would be supportive of coaching, and when was it about capacity, you know, sort of building strength and conditioning and movement, when was it about helping them to pick up visual information or information that they would need in a competition, you know, whether a horse jumping on its own is non-representative, or whether that's quite useful if they're not used to it yet and they can start to pick up perceptual information without the interference of having to balance a rider before they do it with a rider, so that, you know, so they were, you know, the conversations were incredible.
Yeah, they're a good group, and I think help each other along quite a lot as well. So that's quite nice. And you're sort of segueing, I think, in, you know, not necessarily the end, but into one of our sort of final questions around supporting other coaches, I think, in terms of like entering into, you know, maybe doing things differently. What would you say to coaches that are interested in that space, and, you know, almost working in I know you're starting to build a community with some others, you know, how do they get into that, and how do they start to explore constraints in equestrianism?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, if they wanted to get in touch, I mean, I'm very happy to support other people. I learn, they learn. It matters. Like I say, I want to create this new attractor basin that's not having them banned. Very committed to supporting anybody who who wants to be, you know, exploring it. So yeah, so they certainly get in touch with me, and I think there are other people who are doing things as well. They're certainly starting to. My final research project is going to be explore is basically, I've got I think about 40 altogether, although I'm hoping they don't all stay for the entire thing, just because I don't think I'll be able to manage the data. But if they want to, I'm not going to kick anyone off. So they're senior coaches, coach educators, coach developers within equestrian sports, and you know, grassroots, because I want to sort of explore people working across lots of different areas. In many ways, like with paddling, the lower levels or in the middle can be the hardest, because you know, a flat arena or dressage, a flat arena is harder. It's like flat water, you've got to get creative. Whereas, you know, a really easy to understand environment gives you everything you need because it's there already, you know. So yeah, just to connect, and part of that is I'm going to follow them, starting to utilize a constraints-led approach a bit more in their coaching. They are making me smile, because those of them going, is it all right if I've already started? Because this is fascinating, and I'm getting these results. I'm like, yeah, of course. So, you know, like this is it's an action research project.
Yeah.
You know, like, you don't have to wait till I tell you to start. Crack on. So I'll be following them and sort of the stuff they're using and how they're getting on with it. And the idea then is to put that into a sort of a CPD module for equestrian sports. And I'm going to see if I can persuade the NGBs to pick it up, but if they don't, then that'll be made available. So that's one bit of the puzzle.
Nice. So read your paper and connect with you and like get into this space, I guess, is
and then
the way
I
into it.
connect with, like I say, that's quite a big group that's are phenomenal. I'm learning masses from, you know, I'm the one tiny bit of this big group of people.
Yeah, I think that's what we're enjoying as well, is learning from people like yourself and sort of
definitely
listening to what's going on. And is there anything that you sort of think there's a golden nugget you want to share, or have we been able to cover most things?
I do, you know, I mean, obviously I'm preaching to the converted with you too. We're here called the Constraints Collective. I think the really brilliant thing about a constraints-led approach is it gives you some things to hang your practice off, some principles and some questions, and helps you, you know, focus. Am I over constraining? You know, what's going on here? And the two key bits for me are, like I said, it's, you know, have both athletes, horse and human, are they moving through with self-determined motivation? In other words, are they choosing to do it? Do they have agency? Are they able to make that decision? You know, and the second bit is, you know, is the movement self-organized, or is it being over constrained again? So those are probably the two bits that I think are most at the moment where I'm playing at the moment.
Watch this space.
Watch this space. Yeah, it's ever evolving.
Yeah.
And the relationships, that's the most important bit. I mean, horses don't care if they don't like you, your stuff, you know. So the relationships, and that has to be authentic, you know.
Seems to be key in a lot of coaching, I think.
Yeah, very good. That was lovely. Thank you.
You're welcome. That made sense. There was something of some value somewhere in there.
Oh, there's a lot of value. Yeah.
Really good. Thank you so much for sharing.